number one. It's Austin Ekeler. All right.
Boo.
So Austin Ekeler, by the way, Nostradamus, aka Derek Favret, said in his wisdom preseason as one of his bold predictions that Austin Ekeler would finish outside the top 20 running backs. And at the time, people scoffed. There was literally riots in the streets. There was pitchforks, I believe, outside Derek's house. It was wild. I haven't seen a pitchfork in person up until that moment when Derek said that and they were outside his home. It was a wild time. But Derek anyway said that he finished, by the way, RB24 in PPR points per game, and he was second, though, in ADP. So what's your thoughts about Ekeler here? Does he bounce back? Is he coming back to the Chargers? What happened to him? Talk to us about Austin Ekeler's season.
Oh boy, I hate every bit of this. I don't think I'm against the grain with him as my number one bust. I think it's pretty standard across the industry, unfortunately, that many people who wrote these articles have Austin Ekeler as the number one bust. And again, Bob, the number one becomes that he was the second running back off the board in most circumstances, right? You have Christian McCaffrey, and then you have Austin Ekeler. People didn't really believe in Derrick Henry again. Alvin Kamara was suspended. Jonathan Taylor was out. You had a lot of your stalwart guys not in that top five. So Austin Ekeler was the bona fide number two behind Christian McCaffrey, and maybe people even drafted him over CMC somehow. Unfortunately, though, like Tony Pollard, there was no reason to think outside of age-ish and maybe lingering injuries that this wasn't going to pop off. There was no red flags for me coming into the offseason with Austin Ekeler. If anything, it was green flags that this offense was going to get healthy. Another year of Herbert. We were going to turn it around for the Chargers. Annual expectations, blah, blah, blah. And here we are, unfortunately. Like Tony Pollard also, Bob, to add salt to the wound, week one, the number one running back in fantasy football was Aaron Jones. But the number two fantasy football running back.
I was going to say Austin Ekeler. You got
Of course you were. That's this is professional TV. That's how we do this. The number two, though, was Austin Ekeler. 26.5 PPR fantasy points, Bob. That's a weak winner if you didn't go up against Tyreek Hill when he had 51. We'll talk about that some other day. 26.5 PPR fantasy points. He was seventh overall on the week. That includes quarterbacks, right? Now, he was a top running back in fantasy football from weeks 8 to 10. They had a bye week. He had kind of a rough start to the season. Gets back into it. Weeks 8 to 10, he was on fire, averaging 22 PPR fantasy points per game. Now you're getting ready for like a playoff push. Chargers are looking better, whatever. After that, though, no good. Justin Herbert gets hurt again. Mike Williams is done for the season. Keenan Allen starts to rack up. Quentin Johnston doesn't pan out as that first-round pick. Josh Palmer was out for a chunk of this as well. Now, all of a sudden, Austin Ekeler missed the 3 games early in the season. Week 1, he has 26 fantasy points. He gets hurt. He's out week 2, 3, 4. They had a bye week in week 5, so he was out for the first month of your season, unfortunately. After that, he had one more 20-plus PPR fantasy performance in week 14, but he had less than 12 PPR fantasy points in 9 of his 14 healthy games. Let me say that one more time. Less than 12 PPR fantasy points in 9 of 14 games. Again, Bob, in PPR, it does not take much to get 12 PPR fantasy points, especially for a guy like Austin Ekeler. He can get that on a drive or a quarter or a half. He didn't have that in a whole game in 9 of his 14 healthy games. If you somehow made it to the fantasy playoffs with Austin Ekeler on your team, because you got Kyron Williams late, you worked out, whatever. Then in the fantasy playoffs, he was running back 34. And unlike Ramondre Stevenson, and unlike Josh Jacobs, who I just bashed, Austin Ekeler played, which made it even worse. Now, no Justin Herbert, no Keenan Allen, so this offense was in trouble. But even more so, more work for him didn't matter. 9 PPR fantasy points per game, running back 34 down the stretch in your fantasy playoffs. You're never going to bench a guy. I mention it every week on the program. You do not auto start your studs. You look at positions. If you started Josh Jacobs, or if you started Stephon Diggs and you started Austin Ekeler every single week in your fantasy playoffs, you probably didn't play in your fantasy playoffs, right? You look at the matchups, you look at the circumstances, but it's hard to bench a guy like Austin Ekeler. to add more salt to the already horribly salty wounds, Bob, not looking good for next year either. Coming up on age. The guy works out like an animal, right? So like physically he looks great, but he looked slower when he got hurt. He had his lowest reception total since 2019 with 51 receptions. And then he went from 20 total touchdowns in 2021 and then followed that up with an unprecedented 18 total touchdowns the next year to just 6 total this season. Again, Justin Herbert got hurt. He missed 4 games of himself and then shut him down. The ADP of a top 5 back and really running back number 2 destroyed him with what he could do. Because when you draft a guy that high, they have to be the best or they're a bust no matter what. Like if Austin Ekeler was like the RB7 on the season, that's really great. He would have been a bust because he wasn't RB2 or better. But he wasn't. He plummeted, unfortunately. So numbers went down in general across the board in just authentic stats. He didn't produce in the fantasy playoffs when he did play. And then he racked up a couple more injuries, and he's already had a few low body injuries, unfortunately. So this Charger offense, man, annual anticipation, annual expectation. I love Justin Herbert. I love Keenan Allen. I want these guys to succeed, but so far they haven't been able to. And Austin Ekeler's been one of the most fun running backs in the last 5 years since he took over for Melvin Gordon with the Chargers a few years ago to have in PPR leagues and have on your team. Unfortunately, I think this is the time to fade him in Dynasty, like trade him off your team in Dynasty. And second round pick next year, sure, there's plenty of upside. If he remains in the first round somehow, though, Bob, in drafts, there's no chance I'm taking him anymore as a top 10 running back.
So let me ask you this question. If he finished as the RB15 this year, where would you put him on your list?
I think he'd still, again, you drafted him as a second running back. So he'd probably be like, let me put him at 5 because I feel an obligation to mention him as a bust, right?
Yeah.
But let's move everybody else up. So Tony Pollard would probably be my number 1, for example. And then we'll put Austin Ekeler at number 5. But he'd still be on my list because, again, when you have that expectation, the expectation's there no matter what. So it still would have let you down.
That's why a reason why I bring that up. In the 9 games with Justin Herbert, he played, he averaged 15 PPR points per game. That would have been RB15. So that's kind of, it's still disappointing, but that's where he was with Herbert. The Easton Stick thing, I mean, I know we had a pretty nice season with backup quarterbacks, surprising and not doing better than expected, but Easton Stick really wasn't one of those guys. And he just did not play well with Easton Stick. Now, the couple things we shouldn't have been as aggressive on Ekeler. Now, I get it. Kellen Moore came in number 1. The one thing that we should have noticed is that Kellen Moore's offenses don't feature the running back in the passing game as much as he was. The Chargers led the NFL in targets to running backs, okay? So we should have seen a natural progression back to the mean there. But Kellen Moore was closer to like league average. I'm not saying Tony Pollard and Zeke didn't get touches in the game, but Ekeler had 127, I believe, targets 2 years ago. That's not going to happen again in this offense with Kellen Moore. The other aspect of it was Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, when he's within the games, we know Ekeler gets a little bit, he's not as involved in the passing game. This all led to him seeing about 2.2 targets less per game. In fantasy football, it's about, I mean, Eckler's really good. He averages about like almost, I don't want to say 2, but like a 1.7 points per target. So that's 3.4 points per game is a lot, is a lot. So but you got to understand, Ekeler was so much better than everybody else. Even if you took 3.4 points away, he still would be a top 5 to 7 pick in fantasy football. So there was bigger issues, and a lot of it comes in his red zone work. If you look at the red zone work, he had 51 in 2022. He had 72 opportunities in the red zone. That's targets and carries. He had 16 touchdowns on those opportunities. In 2023, he only had 38. He only had 5 touchdowns. He had 0 receiving touchdowns, and the year prior he had 5. So just the red zone work alone plummeted. The loss of Justin Herbert. Another minor thing too is they lost their Pro Bowl center Corey Linsley early on in the season. He was a linchpin guy for them as well. So that was a problem. And I think going into this, by the way, I'm under the assumption Jim Harbaugh is going to be the head coach. Maybe I'll be right. Maybe I'll be wrong.
I agree.
But if you look back to your boy Jim Harbaugh,
Frankie Gore, baby. Frankie Gore. Let's go.
By the way, Not prime Frank Gore, 28, 29, 30, and
Oh, didn't
31-year-old Frank
Frank
Gore
Gore
did
can
not
still
matter.
play, bro.
Frank Gore in his late 20s and early 30s was still a top 12, like he wasn't top 12, but he was high-end RB2 consistently to mid-range RB2 the 4 seasons he was with Jim Harbaugh. But the biggest thing with Frank Gore was that he was not involved in the passing game because Colin Kaepernick took over. So
Yep.
knowing that Justin Herbert will target Austin Ekeler, if they bring back Ekeler under the Jim Harbaugh situation, I do think there will be we didn't even take Ekeler, by the way, in our top 24.
No,
So
that's
if
what I'm
he
saying.
starts
He's already out the
falling,
second round.
I mean, he's already out of the second round. If we're talking third round Austin Ekeler on the Chargers offense under Jim Harbaugh with, Justin Herbert coming back, there's going to be a huge buying opportunity here. I think if RB15 with Herbert is the floor and he could bounce back and get some, red zone work back, you're probably looking at a top 12 running back next year. So I'm not worried about the age. By the way, his touches, he only has 990 carries. By the way, Derrick Henry has like 2,200
Yeah, he doesn't
carries
count,
in his
so
career.
Don't compare anyone to Derrick Henry.
No, I know, but 990 carries is not near a cliff.
No.
I actually broke this down in my preseason article about Derrick Henry, about his age, and if we have to worry about his age. And trust me, there's been plenty of running backs. We just saw a handful. Like Raheem Mostert was 31 years old, and he did well this year. We've seen it plenty of times. It's more situational. So if Herbert comes back, they bring in Jim Harbaugh, and they have the same offensive line. They have Keenan Allen. Mike Williams comes back. Josh Palmer. You're going to want to buy that offense. So I can see Ekeler getting back into that second round. But that's all we got here, Sky.